In a seemingly perfect marriage, Patrick Sullivan, a dedicated prosecutor, discovers a chilling betrayal. His wife, Laura, an ambitious lawyer, has been entangled in a secret affair with her powerful boss, Frank Patterson. Consumed by anger and humiliation, Patrick's world unravels as he embarks on a dark path of revenge. As Patrick meticulously plans his retaliation, his emotions swing from heartbreak to cold determination. Laura, torn between guilt and fear, watches helplessly as her once loyal husband becomes a man she no longer recognizes. The boundaries between love and hate blur, setting the stage for a high-stakes confrontation where loyalty, justice, and vengeance collide in an unpredictable, life-altering climax. The jury returned, their faces revealing a mix of emotions. Some glanced at the defendant, Leroy Johnson, while others looked away. It had been a challenging case, and as the assistant district attorney, I, Patrick Sullivan, knew it all too well. Leroy was a hard-working union carpenter, a good father, and once a devoted husband. But his world crumbled when he came home early one day and found his wife in bed with another man. The man, much larger than Leroy, refused to leave, leading to a fight where Leroy, in a fit of rage, overpowered him. In the chaos, Leroy accidentally injured his wife, giving her a mild concussion. The case focused on that injury. Defending himself against a bigger man was understandable, but the domestic violence charge complicated things. My boss, Stan Condos, eager to bolster his tough-on-crime image for an upcoming Supreme Court run, handed me the case with clear instructions to win. During the trial, Leroy's bosses testified to his character, and Leroy himself was honest and straightforward on the stand. Despite the stress, he didn't try to paint himself in a better light. The trial was tense, and when the jury finally delivered their verdict, Leroy was found guilty of third-degree assault, a lesser charge with a maximum sentence of 1 year. As I left the courthouse, relieved the verdict wasn't harsher, I realized I was late for my wife Laura's firm's Christmas party. Laura, a highly successful financial lawyer, had been my wife for nearly 5 years. We met when she interviewed me for a summer job at her prestigious law firm. I was captivated by her from the moment we met, though our interview hadn't gone well. Despite that, we somehow connected, leading to a relationship and eventually marriage. Now, as I rushed to join her, I hoped she wouldn't be too upset by my tardiness. The school visit from big firms was more for show than substance, a game where both sides could claim they were doing their part. Meanwhile, Laura was honing her interviewing skills, but I was more focused on my growing attraction to her. During the interview, she asked about Edward Kincaid, a prominent figure and my mock trial coach. Kincaid, known for his sharp legal mind, was a mentor to me and my friend Stephen Fitzgerald. Though he never practiced law himself, Kincaid taught us valuable courtroom strategies. Laura mentioned rumors of Kincaid running for governor, but I was more concerned with our upcoming mock trial against Harvard, which Kincaid was confident we'd win. Our conversation stretched on for over an hour, mostly about Kincaid, but I didn't mind. I was captivated by Laura. Somehow that interview led to drinks and eventually to a relationship. We married while I was still in law school, despite my initial hesitation. Laura, already established in her career, saw no reason to wait. After graduation, I followed Laura to Albany when she took a job in municipal finance. While Laura thrived in her career, I struggled to find my footing. Trial lawyers like me were rare, and it wasn't easy finding work in a city where legal opportunities were limited. Eventually, I secured a part-time job as an assistant district attorney in Van Patten County, covering night court. When the head trial lawyer passed away unexpectedly, I was offered a full-time position, which seemed like a breakthrough. However, Laura and I began to drift apart as she focused on securing a partnership at her firm, a goal she felt was crucial before starting a family. At 32, she was feeling the pressure of time, and our relationship took a back seat to her ambitions. I tried to support her, attending social events and handling things at home, but my unpredictable work hours often got in the way. Despite our efforts, we spent less and less time together. On the night of her firm's celebration, I rushed to the Briar Patch, a maze-like restaurant, hoping to find Laura. The party was in full swing, with over 100 people mingling, but I couldn't spot her anywhere. I searched the main room and then the smaller rooms, but she was nowhere to be found. Just as I was about to give up and call her, I walked down a narrow hallway of booths. At the end, I heard Laura's voice. "Stop that! Someone will see," she said, followed by a giggle. My heart sank. "Come on, Laura, there's no one back here. You know you want me as much as I want you," a deep voice replied. "Please, Frank, I'm married. My husband could walk in any minute. What would he say if he saw you?" Laura responded, sounding more playful than serious. "He's not here, and even if he was, he wouldn't do anything," the man said confidently. I froze, unsure of what to do. Then Laura's next words hit me like a punch. "I know he's not as successful as you, but I don't want to hurt him. Did she want this man more than me?" I leaned back against a nearby booth, trying to process what I'd just heard. "You deserve the rewards of your success. Pat gets a lot out of being with a successful woman like you," Frank said. "I doubt Pat would agree with your plan," she replied. "What can he do? He won't leave you." "You're in control," Frank pressed. After a long pause, she whispered, "Wednesday at your place. I'll say I'm working late, but I need to be home by 11. Is that okay?" Then I heard the sound of a kiss. I stayed frozen in place as they moved back to the main room. My mind was racing. Had I just overheard my wife planning to cheat on me? Laura had always been the dominant one in our relationship, making most of the decisions, from choosing our house to buying the new BMW. I had assumed our marriage was solid, but now I wasn't so sure. I walked back to the main room and quickly spotted Laura, standing next to a tall, handsome man who had to be Frank Patterson, her boss. He was older, at least 15 years my senior, with a confident demeanor that clearly attracted women. Laura introduced us, and Frank gave me a smug smile that made my blood boil. As we chatted about my recent trial, I could tell Frank was unimpressed despite Laura's praise. I wanted to wipe that smug look off his face, but knew I had to stay composed. Laura soon moved us on to meet other colleagues, but my mind was elsewhere. Eventually, we sat down with Laura's secretary, June, and her husband. While the men chatted about sports, Laura excused herself to mingle with other colleagues. I took the chance to ask June about Frank Patterson. She told me he had transferred from the Buffalo office last August, where he had worked in commercial finance. He was a senior partner, and I tried to keep my questions casual, not wanting to seem jealous or suspicious. But I sensed June was careful with what she shared, both of us avoiding the unspoken truth about Laura and Frank Patterson. The evening ended early, and we drove home in my car since Laura had taken a cab. "You're very quiet, my love," she said. When I didn't respond, she continued, "The trial bothered you, didn't it?" I nodded. The more I think about it, the more I see a man pushed to his limits, trying to protect his home. Leroy Johnson was a good father and husband who suffered an attack at home, yet I ended up prosecuting him. Laura touched my arm and kissed my cheek. "You have a strong sense of right and wrong. But in the legal world, things aren't always clear-cut. Sometimes we have to make uncomfortable choices for the greater good. But I love you, my Boy Scout. Promise me you'll keep that kindness. Once I earn my partnership, I'll take care of you, and we can start a family." I stayed quiet, troubled by what else was on my mind. We got home, and though tired, I couldn't sleep easily. The difference between Leroy and me, I realized, was courage. Eventually, I dozed off. Saturday morning, I woke to find Laura sitting on me, a playful smile on her face. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, her nightgown raised. We hadn't been this close in a long time. She leaned in, and we shared a tender moment. I thought about our conversation from the night before. Maybe I had misunderstood her intentions with Frank. Was she just using him to advance her career? I wanted to ask, but hesitated. We had never been a jealous couple, and I had always trusted her. Could I bring it up without causing trouble? That weekend, Laura was unusually affectionate, and I kept trying to find the right moment to ask her what was really going on. Monday evening was quiet, and by Tuesday, I was at night court in a small rural town dealing with minor cases. When I got home, Laura had dinner ready, our usual quick meal. Afterward, we shared another tender moment, but this time I couldn't hold back. "Laura, are we okay?" I asked. "Of course, I just needed you tonight. We're close to a big deal, and once I have that, we'll be set. By this time next year, I could be expecting a baby." "Do you really need to be a partner?" I asked. "Yes, The money will help us a lot. I've worked hard for it, she replied, then asked, Pat, are you jealous that it's me and not you? No, I'm just worried we might lose what we have over money. Oh, sweetheart, I'm not changing. I'll always love you. It will always be us. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On Wednesday at 5 p.m., I parked in the back of the lot at 39 Corporate Woods, where Laura worked. She had told me at breakfast that she'd be working late, but I borrowed an unmarked car from the DA's office to keep an eye on her without being noticed. Laura and Frank came out shortly after 5 and got into his silver Mercedes. I followed them to Volpone, an upscale restaurant. They stayed until around 7:30, and when they left, Frank kissed her as he helped her into the car. They drove to a colonial house in Loudonville, one of the nicest areas in Albany, and I watched as they parked near the front door. I sat in my car, heart pounding, unsure of what to do next. They went inside, and I watched as the lights turned on in the hall and then in a second-floor room. I waited on the street for about 45 minutes, saw the light dim, but stayed another hour to be sure. Finally, I gave up and went home. When I got home, I showered and got ready for bed, knowing I wouldn't sleep. My mind was consumed with thoughts of Laura being with someone else. I didn't cry, not because I think men shouldn't cry, but because I just don't. That didn't mean I wasn't hurt. The sadness and loss were real. Before the Leroy Johnson case, I would have sworn Laura loved me and would never cheat. But now, I wondered if her actions stemmed from a lack of love or respect, or both. I decided to put off dealing with it until the next day. When Laura came home around midnight, I pretended to be asleep. She kissed me gently on the forehead, making me uncomfortable, but I didn't move. Our marriage was over, and I saw no need for a confrontation. Thursday was a cold, bright winter day. I woke up earlier than usual, having barely slept, and left the house before Laura was up to avoid her. At work, I was called into the office of Stan Condos, the district attorney. Stan had one goal: to become a judge. He planned to run for one of the open judicial positions in New York. Despite his reputation for being tough but fair, he didn't have enough money to secure the political support he needed. Judicial elections in New York were often decided in backroom deals at party conventions, where money played a crucial role. Governor Kincaid, my old mock trial coach, had recently complicated things by pushing through a judicial reform bill that required more competitive elections. This meant Stan needed to raise significant funds for his campaign. When I arrived at his office, Stan congratulated me on the Johnson trial, and we exchanged pleasantries. But then he dropped the news. He was resigning to focus on his campaign, and he planned to suggest Dexter Elling take over as acting DA. Stan also revealed that Sheila Naylor, who was more of an assistant than a lawyer, would be promoted to chief assistant. Sheila's promotion puzzled me, as she was ineffective in court, having passed law school through rote memorization. I sensed this move was more about politics than competence, as Sheila's loyalty to Stan was unquestionable. Her grandfather was a state assemblyman, and her father was the county executive. Stan watched me for a reaction, but I felt indifferent. I never expected to get the job, even though I was qualified. Then Stan said something that changed everything. That leaves a full-time position open. I'm going to hire Mary Ellen Seaman. I was shocked. She was fresh out of law school, and during her interview, I had recommended against hiring her. She lacked the right attitude and confidence for court. Standing only 5 feet tall with a youthful appearance, she often got pushed around by defense lawyers. Even in the easiest courts, she struggled. "Come on, Stan. That will leave just me to handle cases," I protested. "Not really. There's still Mark and Tony," he replied. Mark Steele was a good lawyer, but he only worked part-time for the health insurance. Tony Lorenzo could handle trials but preferred not to. Neither of them wanted extra work. "You're doubling my workload. What's in it for me?" I asked. Stan looked serious. "Honestly, I can't offer you anything right now. Maybe in a year or two, things will change if Dexter wins the election in November. I know Dex and I would really appreciate it." I could see the concern in his eyes. I could have quit, leaving everyone in a tough spot, but with my wife's betrayal, I needed the job more than ever. Something inside me shifted. I'd always tried to do the right thing, but now I felt trapped in a dead-end job, betrayed by my wife. It was time to reconsider my options. I forced a smile. "Anything else, boss?" Stan gave me a doubtful look. No, that's it. Sorry, Pat, but I had to make some choices. Back in my office, I closed the door and settled into my big old leather chair, the only nice thing I had. It had belonged to the man I replaced, Tommy Maitland, who had suddenly passed away in court at just 46. His wife had remarried within a year, moving on quickly, just as I feared Laura was doing with Frank. There was a knock on the door, and Katrina Gomez walked in. She was a cheerful young woman, recently joined our staff. Sorry to bother you, Mr. Sullivan. I'm collecting for Bee's retirement gift, she said. I asked how much she needed, and she shyly replied, $10 from the lawyers, but $5 would be great. I handed her a $20. Keep it. It'll help with the others. Thank you, she smiled, noticing my gloomy mood. Is something wrong, Mr. Sullivan? No, nothing's wrong. I have a great job and a great life, I replied with a crooked smile. All right, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And thanks for your generous gift, she said before leaving. As I got up to close the door, I overheard her talking to Marge Zuckerman, our office manager. Why does Pat seem so sad? Katrina asked. Just being overlooked and expected to do everything on his own. The higher-ups really messed him over this time, Marge replied. Their conversation made me feel even angrier. I looked weak, and it bothered me that everyone noticed. I felt powerless, unable to stand up for myself at work or at home. Another man was with my wife, and I couldn't stop it. Just as I was about to sit down, angry and helpless, my phone rang. Sally, our secretary, informed me that Sergeant Brandt from the sheriff's office was there to see me. I didn't want to see him. His daughter, Mary Lou Brandt, had been arrested for drugs, and he was probably here to ask for help. But with a new judge coming, there was little chance of mercy. When Sergeant Brandt walked in, he looked strong and imposing, like a classic movie hero. Mr. Sullivan, he said, shaking my hand firmly. I'm glad to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. You have a strong reputation as a prosecutor, Sergeant Brandt said. I wish we were meeting under better conditions too, I replied. We talked for the next hour, but it didn't lead anywhere. He explained how his daughter, Mary Lou, was a good student and aspiring teacher who had made a mistake. She was shy, nerdy, and easily influenced by the wrong crowd. The photo in her file showed a decent-looking girl who seemed younger than her 19 years. I'll do anything to help my daughter. Please tell me what to do, Mr. Sullivan, he pleaded, his voice filled with desperation. This man, who had served the sheriff's office for nearly 30 years, was humbling himself for his daughter's sake. I felt a strong urge to help him, to find a way to get back at the system that was failing both of us. The best I can suggest is getting Mary Lou into a treatment program. It might help show she's taking responsibility, I said. As I spoke, a nagging thought started to form, a plan I couldn't fully articulate yet. Sergeant Brandt stood up and shook my hand, his eyes glistening with tears. I walked him to the door, and as I turned back, something in me shifted. I wasn't going to just sit back and let things happen anymore. It was time to act, even if I didn't know exactly how yet. The rest of the day, I kept thinking about Frank Patterson, wealthy, arrogant, but weak at his core. I just needed the right angle to bring him down. Later, I found myself at Brown's, a pub in Troy where I'd been keeping tabs on Frank. He was there, as usual, sitting with a group of well-dressed men, bankers, insurance agents, and lawyers. They laughed and joked, clearly part of some networking circle. Lori, a waitress who had been a witness in a high-profile trial I'd attended, approached me. "You find them interesting?" she asked, glancing at Frank's table. "Just one of them," I replied. "Mr. Hands-on?" she said with a smirk. "He's always touching, but he's the worst tipper." "Let me make it up to you," I said, handing her a 50 and ordering another beer. For the next 6 weeks, except for Christmas, I made it a habit to come to Brown's every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Lori and I became friends, and she'd have my drink ready when I arrived. Meanwhile, I watched Frank and his friends learning their routines. They seemed like a tight-knit group of professionals, helping each other out, while Frank drove home to Loudonville each night, always careful to stay within the speed limit. I knew a man like Frank needed more than just a couple of drinks to feel anything, but I was patient. I was waiting for the right moment. Frank's careful driving clearly had a purpose, and I was determined to uncover it. On December 30th, It was B's last day at the office after 30 years, the last 16 at the DA's office. A farewell party was planned at Daisy Baker's, a popular bar in Troy. Chuck Spencer, the junior investigator, drew the short straw and stayed behind while the rest of the team headed to the party. I was supposed to attend too, but I had set up a call with the state police as an excuse to stay behind. After the staff left, I let Chuck go and asked him to keep my plan quiet. Once alone, I locked up the office but left the lights on. B's desk was empty, but her computer was still on. The IT team wouldn't revoke her access until the next day, so I found her password on a sticky note and logged in. Using her credentials, I accessed the state's criminal database. Searching for Frank Patterson returned about 20 results, but after half an hour, I found the right one. His record revealed 2 prior alcohol-related offenses, a DUI reduced to reckless driving 4 years ago, and a DWI reduced to a misdemeanor DUI a year and a half later. With 2 strikes already, one more could mean a felony. The next day, I called Sergeant Brandt to discuss his daughter's case. "Did you get her into a treatment program?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes, I did." "Good. Now, I have some questions for you. You said you'd do anything to help your daughter. Did you mean it?" He looked nervous but answered firmly, "Yes." "Do you still work road patrol?" I asked. "Sometimes yes," he replied. "Do you know the stretch of road between Rensselaer and Albany near the Green Island Bridge?" I continued. "Yes, I do," he said. "Let's say hypothetically a silver Mercedes with a broken taillight drives by while you're on duty, and you smell alcohol on the driver. What would you do?" "An arrest might happen," he said, looking puzzled. "At the very least, a sobriety test?" "Exactly, especially if the driver is a well-known lawyer. Everything should be done by the book," I said, implying more. Brandt looked at me, realizing what I was suggesting. "What are we talking about? A test or an arrest?" "A test that's likely to fail, followed by an arrest. Don't worry, the best defense attorney will be there, and the worst assistant district attorney will be on the other side," I said, hinting at how the case would play out. Brandt nodded, understanding. "I'll be on patrol that Thursday, probably with a very reliable partner." "What time?" "Between 9:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. should work fine," I replied. We shook hands and he left, but the hardest part was yet to come. I had to involve my best friend, Stephen Fitzpatrick. We met at the legislators' dining area in the Empire State Plaza, a quiet spot perfect for private conversations. "How have you been, Pat?" he asked. "Good, Steve. How about you?" "Doing as well as I can," he replied with a knowing smile. Stephen was different from me in many ways. Shorter, more delicate in appearance, but incredibly strong and intelligent. His wife, Susan, was like Laura, successful, beautiful, and unfaithful. Stephen instinctively knew something was up. "What can I do for you, Pat?" he asked, likely recalling Monday night when Lori had been overly friendly with Frank, leaning in too close as he had quite a few drinks, the last one a strong triple. I hesitated, knowing what I was about to ask him would complicate things, but I had no other choice. I needed him to play a crucial role in the plan I was forming against Frank Patterson. When I sat down, Lori brought me a single drink and gave Frank a triple. I leaned in and said, loud enough for his friends to hear, "I need to talk to you privately." His friends took the hint, said their goodbyes, and left us alone. "What do you want?" Frank asked. "I need your help. Since you've been seeing my wife, I want to keep things from getting messy." He tried to deny it, but I showed him photos and evidence of their meetings. Realizing he was caught, he asked, "What do you need?" "Not much. Just a divorce. Simple and clean. Laura won't make it easy unless you convince her. Can you do that?" I asked. Frank took a long drink, then smiled smugly. "I think we should keep things quiet. Remember, this is a no-fault state. You don't need a reason to divorce." "True, but your big law firm could make things difficult for me. Laura is stubborn. She'll need convincing," I replied. We sat for a while, drinking as Lori kept our glasses full. We discussed how to handle the situation. By 10 p.m., we wrapped up and Frank left, looking confident. I followed him out to the parking lot. He hesitated at his car, fumbling with his keys. For a moment, I thought he might call a cab, but he got into his Mercedes and drove off slowly, with a broken tail light. I waited half an hour before following him. As I crossed the bridge, I saw the police lights. They had Frank out of the car, handcuffing him. I drove past, stopping at the Latham Diner. It was 10:40. My phone rang. Laura, wondering where I was. I let it go to voicemail. I ordered a burger, fries, and coffee while Laura called every 20 minutes, her concern growing. I needed to stay clear-headed for what was coming next. I got home just before 12:30. Laura was sitting on the couch looking upset. "Where have you been? You could have at least called or answered my calls," she said. I sat down across from her. "I didn't call because it's too late for that now." "What?" she asked, confused by my calm demeanor. Just then, her phone rang. "You should answer that," I said. "It can wait. I need to know what's going on with you. You've been acting weird for weeks. Just tell me, Pat. What's happening?" "If you answer your phone, you'll find out," I said. Reluctantly, she picked up her phone. I could only hear her side of the conversation, but it was clear Frank was telling her what happened. "Frank, I can't talk right now. I'll see you tomorrow." "What? That's not possible." Her eyes widened as she looked at me. "Never. He would never do that, even if he knew." Then her head dropped. "I understand. Let me talk to him. I'll call you back." She hung up and walked back to me. "Frank says you know about us and that you set him up." "Do I know you've been unfaithful?" "Yes. As for setting him up, I didn't make him drink. He just got unlucky." Laura sank onto the couch. "I'm sorry. I really wanted to fix things for us." "I don't care about your excuses. It's too late for that." "Pat, please don't go down this path. We can fix things. It didn't mean anything to me." "Oh, but it means everything. What exactly did Frank say?" "He said he'll pay the $200,000. "Good. That's his part." "No, you can't do that. You need to calm down. This is crazy." I laughed. "What? You didn't think you were worth that much? Don't sell yourself short. You're worth a lot." She tried to stay calm. "Please don't do this. You'll regret it." "Sorry, but it's too late. Now it's your turn. Frank is in a tough spot. He could lose his law license for a long time. If you want this to go smoothly, you'll have to agree to my terms." I handed her the property settlement agreement I'd been working on all week. As she read it, her eyes widened in shock. "Do you really dislike me this much?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. The agreement was clear. I got everything: the house, her retirement funds, our savings. She got her BMW, $5,000 in cash, and her clothes. I even took the wedding rings. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at me. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. I felt a strange sense of loss, but I pushed it aside. "Why are you doing this? I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to ruin the man I love. You will never recover from this. I'm not asking for myself. I love you. Please don't harm yourself because of my mistakes. Just stop, Pat, before it's too late." "It was too late the first time you were unfaithful," I said, standing up. I couldn't take it anymore and left. The next morning, I walked into Stan Condos's office without knocking. He looked up, frowning. "What do you want?" I smiled and sat down. Last night, a well-known lawyer was arrested for drinking too much. He blew a .22 on the breath test, which isn't surprising given how much he drank. Mary Ellen handled Frank's arraignment but made crucial mistakes. She forgot to request a blood test and didn't get a statement from Sergeant Brandt, who, coincidentally, might have a bad memory today due to someone erasing his daughter's drug arrest record. "What the hell?" Stan exclaimed. "Exactly. That's $100,000 in untraceable campaign donations. All you need to do is quietly step aside to run for judge without naming a successor. If anyone asks, I'm a strong candidate, a great choice." "You're out of your mind. This will never happen," Stan protested. "As I said, it's $100,000 from a source that can't be found." Stan sat there, stunned, before slowly nodding. As I left, he said, "You're the last person I expected to pull something like this." "Well, you never know," I replied. Later, I met Tommy LaCour, the county party chairman, at Malloy's restaurant, a common spot for political deals. "Mr. Sullivan, what can I help you with?" he asked. "You can ask the governor to appoint me as acting DA when Stan resigns to run for judge." "Why would I do that?" he questioned. "I can think of 100,000 reasons, all green with dollar signs." "That's a lot of money to handle," he mused. The term walking around money referred to unaccounted-for cash used on Election Day, but also to the extra funds a county party chairman could use as he pleased. "Let's just say I have it. and I'll make sure it gets to you through someone reliable as soon as the governor picks me," I said. Tommy considered this, then extended his hand. "I hope you're at least a Democrat, Mr. Sullivan." "Just call me Pat. I'm changing my party today," I replied, and we both laughed. Meanwhile, in Albany, Governor Edward Kincaid was reluctantly spending time in the chilly capital. Though he preferred his warm apartment in the city, March required him to be in Albany to oversee the state budget process. On the first Monday of March, the governor was in his office known as the Red Room, where he conducted official business. "Okay, Tony, who's next?" Governor Kincaid asked his top aide, Tony Greco. "Tom LaCour, our chairman for Van Patten County. He's likely looking for money since they don't have much control there," Tony replied, explaining the political dynamics of the county. Kincaid thought for a moment. "What if I offered to attend a few fundraising events for him? That should help, and I'm stuck here anyway." After agreeing on this strategy, Kincaid's assistant, Mrs. Betty Morgan, brought Tommy in. After some small talk about Tommy's daughter and son, they got to the main topic. "Well, Tom, what can I do for you?" the governor asked. "Have you heard that Stan Condos plans to step down as DA to run for judge?" Tom said, surprising the governor. Tony quickly added that they'd heard Stan was considering it. "We believe it's pretty much decided, and I'd like to share our party's choice for the interim appointment." "I'm always happy to hear from those who represent the community. You know local needs better than I do," the governor replied, subtly encouraging Tom to continue. "We think the best candidate is someone who knows that office well," Tom began, growing more confident. "I wouldn't want it any other way," the governor said, curious about who the Democrat in a Republican DA's office might be. "We're suggesting Patrick Sullivan. He's a smart young man and an excellent—" Tom started, but the governor cut him off. "You don't need to tell me about Pat Sullivan. I know him very well," the governor said, signaling his approval. "He could be a great district attorney in a few years when he has more experience," the governor said. "Right now, he's the chief trial lawyer there, and from what we've seen, he's their best." Tom nodded, then surprised both the governor and his aide, Tony Greco, by saying, "Van Patten County thinks this appointment is very important." His direct gaze at the governor carried a clear message. If Kincaid didn't support Sullivan, he could lose Van Patten County's backing in the next election. Though Edward Kincaid didn't consider himself a natural politician, he showed no sign of uncertainty. He concealed his surprise and anger well, knowing that political appointments could be tricky. "I'll consider your view and let you know my decision soon," the governor said, making it clear that he wasn't rushing to a decision. After Tom left, Tony said, "I'll look into this Sullivan guy right away." "No, Tony, stay out of this," Kincaid replied. "Why not?" Tony asked, surprised. "Pat Sullivan is close friends with Stephen Fitzgerald," Kincaid said, making Tony sit up straight. Tony had been involved with Susan Singleton, Stephen Fitzgerald's wife, for over a year, a fact that wasn't a secret. The Singletons were connected to the powerful DeVault family, and Susan was known for her affairs. Kincaid had always had a bad feeling about Stephen, despite his courtroom skills. "Stay away, Tony. We don't need any trouble," the governor warned. Tony nodded, feeling trapped in his complicated relationship with Susan. 2 hours later, Don Pleasant, a retired NYC police chief who handled the governor's personal security, met with Kincaid. The governor asked him to dig into Patrick Sullivan and Stephen Fitzgerald, instructing Don to keep the investigation quiet. "When do you need this?" Don asked. "Yesterday," Kincaid replied, sensing something was off. After Don left, Kincaid sat back in his chair, reflecting on how much had changed since he trained Sullivan and Fitzgerald in trial skills. Were they still allies or now potential threats? Meanwhile, Laura had stopped crying after 2 weeks of non-stop tears. Her day had started poorly, with Frank Patterson publicly scolding her over minor typos in a bond prospectus. Everyone knew his anger stemmed from her complicated situation with her husband, Patrick Sullivan, who was pushing for a divorce. Laura and Frank had maintained what they thought was a discreet affair, but the office gossip had picked up on their relationship. Laura's marriage to Patrick, a kind and supportive man who had always put her career first, contrasted sharply with Frank's alpha male persona. Though Patrick was the perfect husband for a woman with big career dreams, The differences between him and Frank were beginning to trouble her. Laura had met Patrick while interviewing candidates for her law firm, Brentwood and Stringer, and even after 5 years of marriage, she still didn't fully understand the quieter aspects of his personality, differences that were starting to create a rift in their relationship. Patrick wasn't the typical candidate for a summer law clerk position. Only the top students were usually interviewed by senior associates who made the real decisions. Laura, however, was new to the firm, just starting her second year after passing the bar. She had worked tirelessly during her first year, often putting in 80 to 100 hours a week. Now, as a junior associate earning $210 an hour, she had come to Brooklyn Law to refine her interviewing skills. She was interviewing top students, all with impressive credentials, except for one, Patrick Sullivan. His resume showed he was middle of his class with no law review experience, but he had participated in mock trial under Edward Kincaid, a rising political star who many believed would be the next governor. Laura admired Kincaid professionally and was curious about Patrick because of the connection. Patrick was her last interview of the day. When he walked in, he immediately caught her attention with his striking resemblance to a famous actor. He was tall, with light hair that had a hint of red, but what stood out most were his deep, warm, sea-blue eyes. Despite his captivating presence, Patrick was shy and younger than most law students. He stumbled a bit during the interview, making Laura wonder how he managed on the mock trial team. Despite this, she felt drawn to him and suggested they grab drinks after the interview. They went to Captivated on Montauk Street, a casual bar popular with young people in Brooklyn. Over a pitcher of surprisingly potent sangria, Laura noticed Patrick's accent, familiar yet hard to place, with hints of Irish and maybe even Dutch. His voice was sweet, with a unique ringing quality that he seemed unaware of. Just as she was about to ask about it, his friends arrived. One woman in the group immediately stood out. Tall, with striking features, jet black hair, and big brown eyes, she looked like a model. Her companion, Stephen Fitzgerald, was shorter and less imposing but had a quiet, striking handsomeness reminiscent of a young Peter O'Toole. Stephen, like Patrick, was shy, but his light blue eyes locked onto Laura's in a way that felt almost magnetic. This was the second time that day Laura found herself captivated by someone's gaze. The woman introduced herself as Susan DeVoe Singleton, a name that immediately clicked with Laura. Susan was the youngest daughter of Joseph Singleton and Catherine DeVoe, part of a wealthy family with significant ties to the law firm Brentwood and Stringer. Susan's personality was both surprising and delightful, and she and Laura quickly bonded over their shared drive to succeed. As Laura and Susan chatted, the two men at the table remained mostly silent, sipping their wine and communicating with a quiet understanding. Susan explained that Patrick and Stephen had grown up together in Cobble Hill, a middle-class neighborhood, and had been inseparable since childhood. They had gone to the same schools and were now in their second year at Brooklyn Law School. Susan mentioned that she had met Stephen on a blind date that didn't go well, but she seized the opportunity afterward, and they had been together since the summer. Later, in the restroom, Susan asked Laura what she thought of Patrick. Laura hesitated, admitting he was kind of different. Susan then revealed that both Patrick and Stephen were virgins. "They seem a bit innocent," Laura remarked, surprised. Susan laughed and admitted that while she really liked Stephen, she hadn't taken the next step with him yet, joking that she might have to propose herself. Despite her initial hesitation, Laura found herself intrigued by Patrick. Before they parted ways, she wrote her phone number on the back of her business card and made sure Patrick took it, leaving the door open for what might come next. Laura already had Patrick's number and address from his resume, but she wanted him to make the first move. 3 days passed without a call, making her a bit anxious. Then Susan called, inviting her out the next weekend. "Will Pat be there? He hasn't called me," Laura asked, concerned. Susan laughed. "Don't stress. He's really into you. He's just nervous. I'll get Stephen to nudge him." The next day, Patrick finally called, and they made plans for a double date that Saturday. This continued for a few weeks until Laura realized that treating Patrick like other guys wasn't working. She needed to take the lead and he would follow, a dynamic that suited her. Laura had recently ended a casual fling with a colleague, typical of her past relationships that never lasted more than a few months. Men either became too clingy or drifted away. Laura had always been the smartest in her class, but boys were more interested in her looks than her brains. Now, working long hours at a law firm, most men weren't comfortable playing second fiddle to her career. She could have casual relationships, but what she truly longed for was a man who would love and care for her. That man was still just a figure in her imagination, and she feared he might never appear. On her dates with Patrick, Stephen and Susan often joined, making conversations easier and more enjoyable, but everything changed on their third date. Patrick chose a nice restaurant on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, and the evening was perfect. After a delicious meal, they walked to the Brooklyn Promenade where the Manhattan skyline glittered against the night. As they walked hand in hand, Patrick suddenly kissed her. It wasn't the spark she expected, it was warm and comforting. When he kissed her again, she felt a strange ache in her chest, something new and different. That night didn't end like her usual dates. They continued walking quietly, enjoying each other's company. It was the most romantic evening she had ever experienced. The next morning, waking up alone, Laura felt an unfamiliar joy. Half asleep, she realized what it was. The look in Patrick's eyes was one of love, not just physical attraction. For the first time, she felt like someone truly cared for her, not just her looks. But this joy came with worry. Did he really see her for who she was? Laura decided to take things slow to protect her heart, fearing that this might be just another short-lived romance. She was almost 27, while Patrick was only 21, with 2 years of law school left. But his youth made him more available to her, and he was understanding of the demands of her job, adjusting his schedule to fit hers. Laura felt in control of the relationship for the first time, and Patrick didn't seem to mind at all. His only close friend was Stephen, and Laura quickly became friends with Susan. The four of them spent a lot of time together, which was great for Laura, who didn't have many close friends in New York due to her demanding career. Susan shared that she also struggled to make close friends, often feeling that people were drawn to her looks rather than who she was. But with Stephen, she found a friendship that wasn't based on romance, allowing her to talk freely. Neither Patrick nor Stephen liked sports, preferring to play games, both physical and mental. They weren't the best students, but mock trial was their passion. They dedicated days to preparing for competitions and took time to recover afterward. Finally, Laura had the chance to see one of their mock trials. She was excited not only to watch Patrick in action, but also to meet Edward Kincaid. Ironically, they were matched against her alma mater, Yale. She worried they might lose badly, but was surprised when the match turned out to be one-sided. Yale was the team that lost. Brooklyn's team had 3 members, Patrick, an Asian girl, and Stephen. Patrick started the presentation on time, speaking clearly and confidently. Yale began strong but quickly fell behind. By the time Stephen finished, it was a landslide victory for Brooklyn. Laura sat in her seat, amazed. It felt like she was watching a completely different person. Patrick's usual shyness was gone, replaced by a confident and skilled speaker who captivated everyone. Laura met Ed Kincaid afterward, who was clearly proud of his team, calling them his men. Patrick and Stephen beamed under his praise. That night, Laura took Patrick back to her apartment, intending to get closer, but he fell ill, with chills and nausea. She put him to bed and lay beside him, just holding him, which seemed to help. By morning, he felt better but was still exhausted. Over the next few weeks, Laura noticed a pattern. Patrick often got sick after big events and was drained the next day. When she mentioned it to Susan, she learned that Stephen also felt worn out, though he didn't get physically ill, just shaky. "It must take a lot out of them to act like that," Susan remarked, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One day she ran into John Stringer, a senior lawyer at her firm, in the elevator. Nervously, she mentioned Patrick's post-trial sickness. Stringer chuckled. "He has stage fright, Laura. It's common to feel nervous before and after like butterflies in the stomach." Laura asked if it would go away. "No, you just get used to it or move to something like commercial finance," he replied with a wink. Meanwhile, Susan was getting married. She proudly shared how she had gotten Stephen to propose before he could finish asking. "I think a June wedding is traditional," she told Laura, already planning the details. Laura expressed concern about Stephen being so young and still in school, but Susan brushed it off. "He's 22 and I'm 27. It's time for me to be married." Susan, already a junior partner at a top PR firm, made 5 times what Stephen would likely earn after law school. But she didn't mind. Stephen's supportive nature was what she valued most. "He has everything I want to come home to. Good looks, a nice personality, and real love. I never have to worry about silly arguments with him." Susan invited Laura to join her and Stephen for some fun before the wedding, often going out with Susan's sister Lisa. Lisa, like her brother, was tall and strikingly beautiful. The 3 women would frequent trendy bars, drawing attention wherever they went. Susan was particular about the men she attracted. She liked them big, strong, and confident. Laura often wondered what Susan saw in Stephen. "It's simple," Susan explained. "He lets me live my life the way I want to and puts my career ahead of his own. There aren't many men like that." Curious about Susan's drive for success despite her family's wealth, Laura asked, "With the money your family has, why are you so eager to succeed?" Susan revealed that the DeVoe family money was almost gone by the time her mom married her dad. "My dad is a gambler, a good one, but still a gambler. Our business is really reinsurance, handling the big risks. My dad is like the casino owner, not the one losing at the table, but eventually, luck can turn. We've had our money troubles every few years since I was little. My dad might win big, but he can also lose big. I need to be able to take care of myself," Susan explained. Laura silently agreed, thinking you never really know what life will bring. Later, Laura tried to re-engage Patrick, who had been resting. Though she didn't particularly enjoy these moments, she found them easier than other methods. In college, she had tried different approaches with guys, but this was the quickest way to get their attention. She moved closer, touching him gently. "Want to change things up?" she asked. Susan eventually kicked the guys out, saying she needed to rest before her fiancé arrived. Laura felt a strong sense of guilt. She had never done anything so wild before and wondered what Patrick would think if he knew. Would he even want to see her again, knowing what kind of woman she was? She reassured herself that she hadn't betrayed Patrick. They weren't engaged, and there were no serious commitments yet. They hadn't been intimate because she thought he was too young and inexperienced. If they were to take their relationship to the next level, it would mean much more than just a wild night. She wanted to be the person Patrick deserved if she wanted to stay with him. Laura decided then that their relationship needed to grow slowly, with more intensity and commitment. She understood now how deeply she loved him. 2 weeks later, Susan married Stephen in a grand wedding in New Canaan, Connecticut. The event was filled with Susan's mother's relatives and her father's business partners. Laura, a bridesmaid since Pat was the best man, couldn't help but reflect on her own relationship as she watched the ceremony. As July turned into August, Patrick returned to school and Stephen, now living with Susan in Chelsea, did too. Laura began urging Patrick to move in with her. "It will give us more time together," she argued, though she realized she was pushing him. He was hesitant to tell his religious parents about their living situation, and she understood that. But Laura was ready for marriage and didn't want to wait. She was determined, whether Patrick liked it or not. "Laura, please, let's figure this out," he pleaded. "Okay, but I love you and want to be with you. You should understand how tough my job is," she said, her voice pleading for understanding but also hinting that she felt he didn't love her enough. Laura began to subtly manipulate Patrick's feelings, knowing that if she kept pushing, he might see proposing as his only way out. She knew he might think he could delay the wedding, but she had other plans. About 2 weeks into the new school year, Patrick finally gave in. Exhausted from trying to balance everything, he proposed with a small engagement ring, only half a carat. He had scraped together every penny he could, most of it from playing cards in the student cafeteria with Stephen. They even managed to beat Ed Kincaid at bridge, though Stephen had to cheat to win. Despite the ring's modest size, Laura valued it deeply. She took Patrick to meet her family, her parents and 3 younger sisters. Her dad, hoping Patrick might be the son he never had, was skeptical at first, but warmed up when he saw Patrick could hold his own in sports talk, even though he wasn't particularly interested in typical guy activities. Laura discovered that almost every game Patrick and Stephen played, Stephen found a way to cheat. They couldn't afford a big wedding, but Laura didn't want one anyway. They had a small, simple ceremony and spent their honeymoon in Las Vegas. It was budget-friendly, and Pat's lucky streak at blackjack won them $5,000, which caught the casino staff's attention. Susan and Stephen joined them for the last 2 days, and the four of them had a great time. By Tuesday, Laura was back to work. 2 years later, Laura informed Pat they were moving to Albany. Pat had graduated and passed the bar exam on his first try, but he still didn't have a job. A senior associate position opened up in municipal bonds in Albany, and Laura saw it as her chance for a promotion. Jobs like this were rare after the recession, so they made the move. Once in Albany, Laura suggested they settle down, as the housing market had just dropped. She found a charming 200-square-foot ranch in a nice area called Redmond, and Pat agreed to the purchase. Pat found part-time work with the Van Patten County District Attorney's Office, working nights at the village court. Although he wasn't thrilled with the job, his bosses seemed to like him, and within a year, he was promoted to a full-time position, even if the pay wasn't great. Life seemed stable until Frank Patterson entered the picture. Patterson, a tall, fit, and attractive senior partner in his mid-40s, was a Harvard Law graduate who commanded attention. He started in the Washington office and worked his way to Albany. From the beginning, he was friendly with Laura, complimenting her on her work, her clothes, and especially her looks. It felt like flirting, which was flattering, but Laura was married. At first, she didn't flirt back, but Patterson was persistent. Laura found herself in a difficult position. Brentwood Stringer, like many firms, had been hit hard by the economy, and promotions were scarce. She had moved to Albany to increase her chances in a smaller office, focusing on the more profitable municipal finance sector. Patterson dangled the promise of a partnership in front of her, and eventually, she took the bait, rationalizing that it was for both her and Pat, and for the family they wanted to start. Pat had never really discussed having kids. He was younger than her, and she assumed it wasn't on his mind yet. But Laura needed the partnership, and she needed it quickly. Patterson exploited this, sensing her vulnerability. He secured his hold on her during the firm's Christmas party, where he met Pat and quickly dismissed him as weak and unimportant. Patterson believed Pat might even be grateful for making his life easier. He relished the power he had over Laura, taking her straight to his bedroom the first night he had her at his house, making it clear who was in charge. Their affair continued, but by February, Laura was growing tired of it. Patterson was too controlling, too forceful, and simply too old for her taste. She liked to be playful and free, something Frank couldn't offer. By President's Day, Laura decided to end the affair, telling Frank she suspected her husband was getting suspicious. Frank didn't believe her until Pat confronted him, and everything unraveled. Pat approached Frank after one of his networking meetings, a gathering Frank attended regularly as he tried to build a client base, fearing the firm might push him out. Solomon, one of the senior partners, was keeping a close eye on him, and Frank knew he couldn't afford a public scandal. Pat's approach was surprising. He didn't want to make their issues public, which relieved Frank. He assumed Pat didn't want people to know he couldn't keep his wife. They talked about keeping things quiet, and Frank, not noticing how the waitress kept refilling his glass, continued drinking. He should have called a taxi, but he decided to drive carefully along a familiar route instead. The police were waiting for him. They were from the Van Patten County Sheriff's Department and took him to a small town court where the reality of his arrest only hit him when they asked if he wanted to call a lawyer. Suddenly, Stephen Fitzgerald, a well-known defense attorney, was by his side explaining the situation. Frank was in big trouble, but he could get out of it, for $200,000. At first, Frank couldn't believe it. Patrick Sullivan, the weak husband, had set him up and was now demanding money. Frank had spent most of what he earned on a fancy colonial house, a Mercedes-Benz SLS GT, a boat on the river, and a summer camp in the Adirondacks. Now, he needed to come up with $200,000. Frank Patterson realized he'd have to dip into his retirement savings to come up with the $200,000, which would cost him in taxes and force him to scale back his lifestyle. He was furious that Patrick Sullivan, a young assistant district attorney from Brooklyn, had outmaneuvered him. Frank believed he deserved better and resented being bested by someone he considered insignificant. Determined to get back at Patrick, Frank stewed in his anger. Meanwhile, Laura's secretary June knocked on her office door. June often spoke highly of Patrick, and Laura wondered what June thought of her now. "Mr. Solomon wants to see you," June said, concern on her face. "Are you okay, Laura? Should I tell him you need a moment?" "No, I'm fine," Laura replied, heading to Saul Solomon's office. Saul's office was on the 5th floor, used for meetings with important clients and government affairs. When Laura entered, Saul, in a rare gesture of warmth, invited her to sit with him in a cozy corner of the room, where tea was already prepared. "Come sit with me, Laura, and tell me how you like your tea," Saul said, motioning her to the sofa. Laura felt uneasy. Saul was known to be most unpredictable when he was being exceptionally polite. "Mr. Solomon, I'm sorry for all the—" Laura began, but Saul cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The apology should come from me," he said, "and just call me Saul, like my partners do." He leaned back, his hands resting on his stomach. "I knew about Frank Patterson's ways and should have done more to protect you. I thought you could handle him, but I see now that wasn't the case. I should have understood how tough things are at home for you. Men from Ireland can be quite emotional, and it seems Mr. Sullivan reacted strongly to your situation." Laura let out a small laugh despite her worries, as Saul had a way of making serious problems seem trivial. "Yes, his reaction was over the top, but I doubt he sees it that way." "Good," Saul said with a chuckle. "Maybe this will be a lesson for Frank. He can't keep getting away with causing trouble. But now we need to talk about you. Laura, you are my partner. Being a partner here means we share in each other's successes and challenges. Starting tomorrow, you'll be moving to government affairs, and Jim Smallwood will take your place in municipal finance." "But I know very little about lobbying, and won't Jim see this as a step down?" Laura asked. Saul laughed heartily. "Having a charming woman like you will only help him, and you don't know Jim well if you think he won't see this as an opportunity to push Frank Patterson aside and move up in the company." Laura had to admit Saul was right. He always managed to come out clean, even in the messiest situations. "Thank you. I will do my best," she said, preparing to leave. "Stay seated," Saul said, refilling her cup. "We still need to address your husband. We can't let anyone think they can win against us." "Oh, please, Mr. Solomon, don't hurt Patrick. I've already caused him enough trouble. I just wish I could undo everything." Saul smiled. "I was hoping not all was lost. I like your husband. Let's see what we can do to bring him back to you. I believe that would be best for everyone." "But he wants a divorce. He made me sign an agreement." "Miss, this is one of the best and most powerful firms in New York. One young man isn't going to beat us," Saul said, though he didn't mention that he and Jack Stringer had already decided to stop the divorce no matter what. Jack had argued that you shouldn't leave a marriage at the first sign of trouble. "I've seen them together. The young man is immature and has a quick temper, but it's clear he loves her and she loves him. If we can help him grow up, this can work out." Saul turned to Laura and said, "You have friends here, and we believe your husband just needs some time to think things over." He then called Angela Zink, the head of the family law group, and arranged for Laura to request counseling before the divorce could proceed, knowing they could ask a judge to order it. Saul also made a long-distance call to Bella Moskowitz, the best marriage counselor in New York City, arranging for Laura to meet her. When Laura left Saul's office, she felt like a new person, with a glimmer of hope that things might work out after all. Laura felt a renewed sense of hope, thanks to Saul's help, and began to see her situation differently. Maybe she had a chance to win Patrick back. Meanwhile, Governor Kincaid was stuck in Albany. It was the second week of April, and though spring had arrived in New York City, Albany was expecting snow. Surprisingly, the legislature was close to passing the governor's budget, almost exactly as he had submitted it in January, despite opposition from State Senator Tilden. Kincaid was suspicious. It all seemed too good to be true. Late that evening, Don Pleasant asked to speak with him. "Send him in," Kincaid told his assistant Betty. Don entered, heading straight to the bathroom where he turned on the faucets to drown out their conversation. Patrick Xavier Sullivan, only child, went to St. Gregory School, Xavier High School, and Fordham University. Graduated from Brooklyn Law and now works as an assistant district attorney in Van Patten County, married to Laura Parker Yale, a partner at Brentwood and Stringer, Don began, a smile forming. He's clever, brave, and sharp. I like the kid. Don spent the next 40 minutes explaining Frank Patterson's cheating, the extortion, and the likely bribes, though most were speculative. There was proof, however, that condos had received money, and LaCour was expecting more. The governor was stunned. He hadn't expected Patrick Sullivan to be involved in something like this. "Can we prove it?" the governor asked. "Not a chance. Fitzgerald is too clever. You'd have better luck finding a needle in a haystack," Don replied. "But I like the way Sullivan operates. He's okay in my book, though Fitzgerald, he's not trustworthy." Kincaid knew Don's assessment was sound. Fitzgerald was risky because he saw the world in shades of gray, while Sullivan believed in right and wrong. But now Sullivan had crossed into the wrong. The governor wondered if Sullivan would return to the right path, and if not, could he still be useful? "Betty, get Arnold on the phone," the governor instructed. By nearly midnight, Betty had reached Arnold Flicker, the governor's appointment secretary. "Governor, Denise says you're not supposed to call me after 9 p.m., Arnold answered, referring to his wife's rule. "Tell Denise it's urgent. I need Patrick Sullivan appointed as interim district attorney for Van Patten County first thing tomorrow," Kincaid said. "Who is this guy?" "He's my secret weapon. Knows how to handle tough situations. I don't expect you to get it, Arnie. Just set him up in case I need him," Kincaid replied. Patrick Sullivan found himself in an unfamiliar position, on the defense. Usually, the courtroom was his domain, but not today. He was the one in trouble. His lawyer, Jeff Davis, was explaining the case to Judge Roxanne "Rocky" Claremont. Rocky wasn't paying much attention to Jeff, and Patrick could sense things were going badly. His wife's lawyer, Angela Zinke, was a tall, cool blonde in her 40s, dressed in a stylish, champagne-colored dress, not the usual dark suit. Angela exuded confidence and toughness. Laura, too, was playing a part, dressed in a Susie Homemaker outfit, her hair tied back, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. It was a far cry from the strong attorney Patrick knew her to be. Patrick pulled Jeff aside. "Put her on the stand. She won't last 5 minutes." Jeff just looked at him, frustrated. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have something to add?" Rocky asked. "Your Honor, I just wanted my lawyer to show that despite how my wife looks today, she is a very skilled attorney and not just a housewife," Patrick responded. "The court is well aware of what each of you does for work," Rocky replied, her voice sharp. Judge Rocky Claremont didn't mince words. "Mr. Sullivan, let me remind you, this isn't about right or wrong. This is about a troubled marriage." She paused, then added, "I believe the two of you may have decided to separate too quickly. The law allows me to order counseling in such cases, and since Mrs. Sullivan has already started working with a well-known counselor and agreed to cover all the costs, I'm setting up counseling here." Judge Claremont leaned forward and whispered something to herself, which Jeff, my lawyer, didn't catch. He jumped up, foolishly asking what she said. "Counseling once a week until the court is satisfied," she repeated. Jeff opened his mouth to argue, but I grabbed his elbow to stop him. It was clear we'd been outmaneuvered. As we left the courtroom, I shot Laura and her lawyer a look that said, "It's not over yet." It took 2 weeks to get the written order, and I only got it after threatening not to comply unless it was in writing. My friend Stephen Fitzgerald helped me go over the order. "Saul Solomon is a smart lawyer," Stephen said, shaking his head. "I can't say I'm thrilled with his cleverness right now," I replied. "Patrick, don't forget we're the ones in a tough spot. Solomon has truth, justice, and most judges on his side. You humiliated your wife and her partner, even if no one can prove it. That doesn't change the fact that they were humiliated." "The order is absurd. It can't stand," I said. "Patrick, please tell me your time in the DA's office hasn't made you lose your mind. Solomon doesn't need to win. He just needs to buy time." "But how long can this go on?" I pointed at the order. "It depends on what you do. The order mandates marriage counseling paid for by Laura and a progress report in a month. It's vague, has no end date, requires a lot of travel, and picks a counselor Laura likes, but you don't. Those are all good reasons to appeal, but for now we go along with it. In 6 months, I'll move the case back to court. Either Rocky grants the divorce, or we take her to court for not making a decision." "You're right, but I don't like being pushed around," I grumbled. "That's the price of revenge, my friend. I hope it's worth it," Stephen replied. On the second Tuesday in April, I found myself in an office building off Fifth Avenue in New York City. The round-trip train ticket cost $102, not much, but over $400 a month would be tough on a struggling assistant district attorney. They probably thought I'd dip into the money I got from Patterson, but I wasn't going to let them trap me like that. The office was a decent walk from Penn Station on the 7th floor of an 11-story building. It felt welcoming, with magazines, coloring books, and crayons on the tables. No receptionist, just a bell to ring. A woman in her 60s, dressed in a long hunter green dress, let me in. The room was cozy, warmly lit, with comfortable chairs and a small coffee table. Laura was already there, clearly having chatted with the counselor. "Hello, Patrick, I'm Bella. Let's just use first names here. We'll be Bella, Laura, and Patrick. Is that okay?" Bella asked, looking at me with deep brown eyes. "Sure," I replied. "I know you don't want to be here, but since you are, please give it a try. It would be a shame to waste this chance because of pride," she said kindly. I nodded. "Here are the rules. You need to attend one session together each week, and before that, each of you will have a 50-minute private session with me. You can talk about anything, though it would be good to discuss why we're here. You can't miss a session without violating the court order, but if something important comes up, we can reschedule. Because of the open order, I must report to the court every month. I'll tell the court when I think you're both ready to end the counseling. Is that acceptable?" she asked, looking at me. I nodded. "Great. I'm a doctor with a PhD and more than 30 years of experience in marriage counseling. I've written several books on this topic and teach at NYU. Now about the schedule. I hear you're free on Tuesdays." "Tuesdays work for me, but Patrick has night court that evening," Laura replied calmly. "Tuesdays are fine, but I need to catch the train at 1:20, I said. "We could drive together," Laura suggested. "No, it's all good. There are early trains," I replied, keeping my distance, both physically and emotionally. Bella concluded our meeting with a clear plan. "I'll see Laura at 9 a.m., you at 10 a.m., and both of you together at 11:30. That'll give you enough time to catch your train, Patrick. You might want to use the travel time to do your homework together, but that's just a suggestion," she said, wrapping up the session. "First, I'm not here to judge or assign blame. I'm not here to decide what's good or bad. Second, I won't label one of you as the victim and the other as the offender. You're both part of this marriage. And while the responsibility may not be equal, both of you need to own your parts," she explained, looking directly at me. "So she cheats, and I'm the one to blame?" I asked, frustrated. "Is that what I said, Patrick?" Bella replied gently. "What I meant is that you both share responsibility, though not equally. You aren't fully to blame, but you do have to acknowledge your role." She continued, "Lastly, I'm not here to keep you together at all costs. We'll explore what's best for both of you and hopefully come to a decision together." When Laura spoke about our marriage without mentioning the affair, Bella kept her eyes on me as if trying to see deeper into who I was. As we left, she leaned in and whispered, "Pat, I know being here isn't what you want, but I hope you're strong enough to make the most of this." I understood her intent. She wanted to break my pride, to soften me enough to take Laura back and let her regain control, but that wasn't going to happen. On the train ride back, I checked the news on my phone. The Times-Union had a headline, "Unknown appointed interim DA in Van Patten." Asterisk. The article was brief, noting my background, where I studied, and how long I'd worked at the DA's office. It lacked details, but I knew they'd update it later. Let them wonder. The best part? Laura would realize I wasn't the weak person she could push around anymore. I was the district attorney, even if only for 8 months. For once, I felt important. The following Tuesday, I arrived for my first solo session with Bella Moskowitz. Laura was just leaving as I walked in. I waited until she was gone, making me a few minutes late. Bella didn't let it slide. "I expect you to be on time, Patrick," she said firmly. Then she asked, "How are you sleeping?" "Fine. Why shouldn't I be?" I replied. "Well, it seems like you've done some things that aren't quite right, if not illegal. Though I'm no expert like you," she said. "I don't see any proof that I did anything wrong." "Is that your standard now? Your wife tells me you have strong moral values. Is she wrong? When did this become about me being guilty? I'm not the one who did wrong here." "Is that really what you believe?" she asked, her voice steady. I think you need to forgive yourself, but you can't do that until you forgive your wife. You see, many men like you try to escape the pain of betrayal by retaliating, but it doesn't work. You'll keep feeling this pain until you face it. So forgive and forget, and everything will be fine? I asked, skeptical. I didn't say that. You need to start by forgiving and then make things right to regain your own respect. You're not at peace with yourself now, and you've pushed away the person who loves you most. Patrick, you're lost. Let Laura help you find your way back. Sorry, I'm not buying that. She did wrong. She chose him. As far as I'm concerned, she can stay with him. I'm patient. You'll come to see things differently eventually. Sooner would be better, but we can wait, Bella said calmly. I hated to admit it, but I was missing Laura. The past week had been awful, and the interim DA position wasn't making things easier. The senior staff resented me for disrupting their comfortable setup, and the pressure was getting to me. Some people thought I was doing well, but that only made me feel worse, like I hadn't truly earned my role. So, Patrick, what do you say to people who ask how you became DA? Bella asked, cutting through my thoughts. The Schenectady Gazette says I studied under the governor, who recognized my natural talent and helped me, I replied, forcing a grin. Does anyone actually believe that? They believe it enough that it's become the truth. As we lawyers like to say, don't mix up facts with the truth. Facts can confuse a jury and get in the way of what they want to believe, I said. I didn't know you were so cynical, Bella remarked. Life teaches you lessons. Just like I thought, you're good, but this isn't going anywhere. She cheated. Plain and simple. No, I think there's more to it. You let her cheat to excuse your own actions. Poor Laura felt trapped. She thinks she's more responsible than you are, but that's an illusion. You've always had the real power, you just needed to show it. Are you sure about that? I asked. Yes, but when will you stop punishing her for being weaker than you? Bella replied. So much for me being the victim and sharing the blame, I said, feeling the frustration rise. Did you think I wouldn't see the truth? Or did you plan to confuse me with your lawyer tricks? Bella asked, her voice calm but firm. So she gets to be with other men while I just watch? I challenged. She wanted what many women want, a child. She waited to start her career, but it was bothering her. She was an easy target for someone like Patterson. She had a husband, but he didn't stand up for her. Maybe he doesn't really love her, Bella said, her tone probing. I loved her, but I knew I couldn't hold her back. She didn't believe in me. So you showed her? Then forgive her. It's the right thing to do. She's in a lot of pain, Bella urged. But what happens to me? How can I consider myself a man if I accept this? I questioned. Bella looked at me with deep eyes and said, I believe in you, Patrick. You're brave. You have too much courage to worry about what others think. It was 4 a.m. on a Sunday, and I had been the district attorney for just 12 days. The house on Indian Hill Road was a simple 2-bedroom ranch. Sergeant Brandt from the Sheriff's Patrol met me on the front porch looking serious. It's in here, he said quietly, leading me into the living room. In the middle of the room lay a body, the carpet beneath it soaked with blood. The sight was shocking, like something out of a nightmare. As I stood there, I missed Laura the most, wishing she were there to help bear the weight of this moment. Phil Sloan, my chief investigator, was crouched by the body. It's hard to identify him, but not impossible. The amount of blood shows he was alive when they did it, Phil said, looking up at me. Everyone was watching, waiting for my reaction. I nodded, determined not to show any weakness. He's got needle marks on both arms, and his tattoos suggest he's a Hell's Angel. Identifying him shouldn't be a problem, Phil continued. No jacket? I asked. No. Either they kept it as a trophy or to send a message. I'd guess the latter, Phil replied. Think it's about drugs? I asked. Probably. It's likely a fight over shipments to Vermont and New Hampshire. Someone wanted to make a bold statement, Phil said. I realized I had stumbled into something major. This headless body would make headlines, but the state police might overlook it. We had limited resources, and solving this case could take years. I knew I'd be held responsible, and it could ruin my chances in the next election. I looked around at my team, seeing the same thoughts reflected in their faces. I'd already lost many staff members since taking over, and those who remained were considering leaving too. This murder was another burden I had to carry, and without Laura by my side, I felt completely alone. My only real friend, Stephen, was busy with a big case in Westchester County. I knew I had to step up and lead. My dad used to say that problems come our way for a reason, and that we have what it takes to handle them. "Let's do our best and trust that everything will work out," I said, and I saw hopeful smiles on their faces as I left the room. When the state police arrived, I quietly hoped they would do their job without making mistakes. Katrina Gomez, now my secretary after many had left, buzzed me to let me know Phil Sloan was here. He walked in with a stack of folders. "We know who our victim is and have a good idea of what happened," Phil said, placing the folders on my desk. "Good afternoon, Phil," I replied, ready to dive into the case that would define my time as acting district attorney. "Nice to see you," I replied, but Phil waved my greeting away. "No time for small talk. We've got a case to crack." He explained that the victim was Ricky St. Simons, a former member of the Hells Angels. Ricky had been involved with a group of women, mostly ex-prostitutes who blended in as housewives. They had a deal with a local used car lot which provided them with minivans for weekly trips to Vermont to bring back heroin. "That's what we found in those tracks. Heroin," Phil said. "So Ricky was transporting heroin?" I asked. "Yes, but he wasn't the dealer. The real dealers are these guys," Phil said, pulling out files on several members of a black biker gang called the Vultures. They operated from New York City to Albany, using Ricky to move the drugs into Vermont. "There was trouble among them," Phil added. "So we have our victim and suspects, but no evidence," I pointed out. "Not yet, but we do have this," Phil said, sliding a folder across the desk. The murder weapon was a machete, and the victim had been killed gruesomely while still alive. It was a tool that had been used in 2 other cases in New York City. The experts recognized the unique marks it left. "They can identify the weapon?" I asked. "That's what the state experts say, if we can find it," Phil replied with a big smile, already imagining the challenge of locating something likely well hidden. But it was a lead we couldn't ignore. A week later, I found myself in a small, windowless room barely bigger than a closet. Across from me sat Kathy Loomis, her big brown eyes locked on me with suspicion. I had picked her up along with her 2-year-old son from outside the social services office. Kathy's older son, nearly 5, was in a nearby preschool. She had pale skin, blonde hair, and those dark eyes that stood out. She was Percy Jackson's girlfriend up north. He had another in NYC, who looked just like her but had 3 kids. Kathy's 2 boys had lovely brown skin, with no official fathers listed, but everyone suspected they were Percy's. "Who are you?" she demanded angrily. "Miss Loomis, I am Patrick Sullivan, District Attorney of Van Patten County." She scoffed. "So, Mr. DA, what do you want from me?" "I need some information, just 2 questions," I said calmly. "Do I look like a fool to you?" "No, in fact, I hope you'll be very smart." "Really?" she sneered. "Yes, because I'd like to avoid putting a nice young woman in trouble for welfare fraud and taking a mother away from her children." She smiled. "You've got nothing, and I know it. They brought me here because my benefits are being reduced. The worker said I should find a job and they'd help with daycare and bus fare. But honestly, taking care of 2 kids is a full-time job. Not quite as full-time as you think. You've been attending school full-time for your nursing degree. Strange you haven't mentioned that, since social services could help with daycare and bus fare for your education. And you don't need bus fare since you've got a 2-year-old Chevy. It might be tough to explain how you paid for tuition and books. St. Rose College isn't cheap. My mom helps me, except she passed away a year ago. But anyone looking at your Pioneer savings account wouldn't know that," I said, handing her the bank statements. "Nobody goes after people for this kind of thing. I'm just trying to make my life better, trying to leave welfare behind. The system is unfair. It doesn't give people a chance to succeed." She was right, of course. Small-time welfare fraud wasn't a priority for most DAs, but things were changing under my watch. "I've got you for not reporting assets like a nice car and cash going in and out of this account. Do you want to risk fighting these charges?" "Are we being recorded?" she asked sharply. "No. Do I look foolish? I just forcefully took a woman and her child. How do you think that looks for me?" "Okay, so what are we doing?" 2 questions. First, 2 weeks ago on Saturday night, who was Jack with? I believe you're his alibi and can tell me who he was really with. "No, I won't betray PJ. I'm not asking you to. I just need to know who he was with." Between you and me, this won't go further. No one knows you're here with me. Got it?" She hesitated, then took the yellow notepad and pencil I handed her. She wrote down the names and passed the pad back to me. "Last question. Who has the machete?" I asked, looking over the names she had written down. Kathy hesitated for a long moment, then circled a name and dropped the pencil on the table. "Are we done now?" she asked, standing up. "Yes," I replied. I got up, knocked on the door, and Brant opened it. After checking that the coast was clear, he let her out. He gave me a knowing look, and I could only smile back. We had a crucial piece of the puzzle. "Follow this one," I said, pointing to the name she had circled. Bella, the counselor, was relentless. She kept pushing me, almost to the point of breaking, but I thought I was strong enough to handle it. Turns out I was naive. Our joint session started like usual, with Laura talking, but things took a sharp turn in my private session with Bella. She fired tough questions at me, but I dodged and defended myself. Then she turned on Laura like a predator ready to strike. "What do you mean you regret what you did with Frank Patterson?" Bella's voice was sharp, cutting through Laura's hesitation. Laura struggled to find the words, and for the first time, I realized how little I actually knew about what happened between her and Patterson. Bella didn't hold back, forcing Laura to reveal details she clearly didn't want to share. It was painful to watch, a mix of sympathy and anger swirling inside me. As Laura broke down, it became clear that what might have felt good in the moment was now a deep wound. Bella kept digging, exposing parts of Laura's past before our marriage, hinting at a reputation I hadn't known about. The confident, bossy woman I thought I knew seemed to crumble before my eyes, revealing someone insecure, worried about her looks, and fearful that men only wanted her for superficial reasons. Tears streamed down Laura's face, her nose running uncontrollably, and she looked utterly broken. When it finally ended, I glanced at my watch. It was 1:30 p.m. I had missed my train. "Don't worry, Laura can't drive back like this. You'll have to drive," Bella said casually, as if we'd just been discussing the weather. As I helped Laura up, Bella waved cheerfully and said, "See you both next week." Laura looked at me with fear in her eyes, while my own were filled with confusion. Bella was supposed to be her counselor, yet she had torn Laura apart. It took us a while to find Laura's car in the parking garage. I helped her into the passenger seat of the BMW convertible, a car I had never liked. It was supposed to be a special gift for both of us, but I always preferred my old Honda Civic. The BMW was a symbol of Laura's success as a lawyer, something that had always annoyed me. But as I helped her into the car, I realized it was more than just a luxury item. It was her way of feeling better about herself. The drive back to Albany was quiet. I struggled to navigate the city even though I grew up there. The parking fee alone was nearly as much as my round-trip train ticket. Laura was curled up in the passenger seat, looking almost asleep. Around Newburgh, she began to cry softly. I didn't know why, but I reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. That made her cry even harder. "Laura, please, it's over. Can you sit up and try to stop crying?" I said. "You don't know how much I miss being close to you. I know that sounds silly, but sometimes I just need to touch you," she replied, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to respond. "I miss the way you used to look at me. I know you hate me now and don't want to see me anymore, but I miss you so much," she said, her tears flowing freely. When we reached Selkirk, I asked where I should take her. That's when I learned she was staying with Susan and Stephen. They lived together, but Stephen was out of town, helping a woman in trouble. As we drove up the newly paved driveway to Susan's house, memories of happier times flooded back. The small farmhouse had grown into a 6-bedroom home with a big garage and a barn they planned to turn into an office. I parked the car by the garage. Laura turned to me, her voice soft and broken. "I never loved anyone like I loved you. I'm really sorry. You may never forgive me, but please remember the good times we had." Then she rushed out of the car, across the stone path, up the porch steps, and into the house. I closed the car doors and turned just as Susan came out, surprising me with her early return home. She descended the porch steps, arms crossed, looking serious in jeans and an old Fordham University sweatshirt that must have belonged to Stephen. Even in casual clothes, she was still the most beautiful woman I knew. Feeling good about yourself, Pat? She asked, her tone sharp. It wasn't me. It was that counselor, I replied, trying to deflect. I get it. Nothing's ever your fault. You just act like a child, she shot back. I could have responded with something hurtful, but I held back. Please, Susan, stay out of this. How can I? Two people I care about are getting hurt over silly stuff. It's not silly to me, I retorted. So sure of yourself and strong. You have no patience for those of us who struggle. I hope someday you and Stephen learn what it means to be human, she said, turning to go back inside. I called a cab and walked to the street, where I had 40 minutes to think. My thoughts drifted to Bella Moskowitz, Judge Roxanne Claremont, Angela Zink, and other so-called good women who, I believed, secretly disliked men and made life tough for us. Susan's parting words echoed in my mind, though I couldn't fully grasp their meaning. Around midnight, Stephen called. Hi, Pat. I'd ask how things are, but I already know, he said. Yeah. What did Susan tell you? I asked. Well, she said you're impossible, immature, insensitive, and maybe a bit crazy. Those are just the highlights, he joked. Sorry, that's not your problem. I know you've got your own stuff going on. It's fine. A good break from my case, he said. But I could hear the weariness in his voice. Really that bad? I asked. Yeah, the other side isn't making many mistakes. She's good. I'll give her that. Just one person? I asked, surprised. Yeah, she's the one who bends the rules. Usually, women aren't seen as great trial attorneys because they prefer getting along rather than fighting. But there are exceptions, he said. I just wish I wasn't starting out behind. Oh, what's that mean? I asked. After a pause, he quietly admitted, the client is innocent. I didn't know what to say, so I simply offered, I'm sorry. Not your fault. These things happen, he reassured me. Everything good with you and Susan? I asked. Why do you ask? She mentioned something strange when I saw her, something about you and me not being human. There was a long silence before Stephen replied, I think she's struggling with my success. I'm not sure, but that's my guess. Well, I might lose this one and things will return to normal. We ended the call with a promise to meet for a drink when he got back. The next day, I met Jenny Trudeau, a woman I had helped before. She had been arrested for solicitation, but the charge didn't seem right, so I let it go. Now, I needed a favor. So, what do you want, Mr. Big Shot DA? Need my help? She asked, knowing all too well about the gossip surrounding my divorce. I need a different kind of favor, I replied, showing her photos of suspects from the Vulture's bike gang. She recognized them immediately. I don't owe you anything like that, she said. The DA needs your help, and I promise it won't come back to hurt you, I assured her. It took nearly an hour, but she finally agreed to help us craft a story that would lead to a search warrant. We planted a scenario where she overheard gang members discussing a machete. I trust you, Mr. Sullivan, to take care of me, Jenny said. I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure. We found the machete in a storage locker in Watervliet, confirming our lead. Following Taylor paid off. Now we just needed someone to talk. I brought Taylor in and held him for 23 hours, charging him with possession of the machete. Then we brought in Little Tom, a massive man who, unlike Taylor, seemed capable of the brutal murder. Realizing Taylor might have turned on him, Little Tom gave us what we needed to make further arrests. By Memorial Day weekend, just 6 weeks into my 8-month term, we struck. The case was making headlines, and I knew the Republican chairman of Van Patten County, Russell DeWitt, was watching closely. He saw the DA's office as an opportunity, especially with the way things were unfolding. I had to prove I could handle the pressure. Now that he had made some key arrests, the same journalists who had criticized him just last week were now praising him as the best district attorney in the state. This forced me to rethink my entire plan. Dexter was running as a candidate recognized by the public, but he was severely underqualified. I knew I could find a better candidate next time, but this presented an opportunity for me to run against Dexter, and I was excited about it. By the end of August, we had been in counseling for nearly 5 months. It had been weeks since Bella had strongly confronted Laura, and during that time, Bella had helped her heal. Laura was regaining the confidence she had when we first married. Bella's tough approach made sense now. Laura was close to forgiving herself, and I was slowly reaching the point where I could forgive her too. But I knew I couldn't stay married to her. To me, Our life together was over. "What's wrong, Pat? Can't you move past your pride?" Bella asked in our private session. "It's not just pride. I can't get over the dreams I once had. I think I married too young, immaturely. I saw Laura as perfect, like a goddess. I guess I wasn't seeing things clearly. Who really knows the person they marry?" I replied. "Marriage is about learning to love the real person behind the mask. You may have been naive, but you don't have to stay that way," she said. "You're right, but it's time to grow up and move on, like you've said. But I want to move forward without Laura," I told her. Bella shook her head. "You're tough, but you might regret this choice. You married Laura with God as a witness, for better or worse. That's a strong bond. You belong to her. I'll tell the judge that counseling will end at the end of September. Until then, I'll help you separate. Is that okay with you?" she asked, looking deeply into my eyes. "Sounds good," I replied. She shared the same news in the group session. Laura looked sad, but she took the news well. When I left, Brant was waiting in a sheriff's cruiser. The death threats had started right after the 4th of July, and by early August, the FBI warned us to take them seriously. The Vultures had hired expensive lawyers from New York and were fighting the charges. Taylor and Little Tom were trying to retract their confessions, and the lawyers claimed the evidence wasn't reliable. As I got into the sheriff's car, Sergeant Brant passed me his phone. It showed a text from Phil Sloan. It said just one word: Geronimo. Brant grinned like a kid on Christmas morning. The code word meant our plan had worked perfectly. About 3 weeks earlier, we learned the FBI was planning to put one of the Vulture's girlfriends, Jasmine Turner, into witness protection. She was one of the few women who spent time with these bikers and was black. The feds turned her, but she knew nothing about the St. Simon murder. However, her initials matched those of Jenny Trudeau, our actual informant. We let everyone believe that JT referred to Jasmine. Even people in our office believed it. Dexter Elling, who wanted to lead the DA's office, was set to be interviewed on local news that Sunday. We hoped he would attack me, thinking I couldn't win the hearing. Geronimo meant the reporter was going to ask Dexter about the hearing. We planned to let him walk right into the trap, but we had to win that hearing first. Mary Ellen Seaman, who had stayed when others left, asked if she could help with the hearing. I hadn't had much faith in her skills, but she deserved a shot. "Okay, you can help, but it won't be easy. You'll need to prepare the witness and ask her questions." "But we don't even have a witness, do we?" she asked. I smiled. The first lesson here is how to trick people. Mary Ellen spent a week writing questions and preparing to ask a witness she couldn't meet. We practiced until she was ready. On the second Tuesday in September, the Van Patten courthouse was closed to everyone except those who needed to be there. Jenny was hidden behind a screen in the main courtroom, visible only to the judge. She had been secretly brought into the courthouse in a trunk and would leave the same way. Judge Drago, presiding, looked surprised when the New York lawyers entered. Jenny remained behind the screen. "Your Honor, we object to this setup. We have the right to confront the witness, not have her hidden behind a screen," argued Thomas Jacobson, the lead lawyer for Percy Jackson, also known as PJC. "Mr. Sullivan?" the judge asked. "Your Honor, this witness is protected for a reason. These men are dangerous and have harmed people before. Our witness will be known as Miss Jane Roe for this case, but we will share her real name with the court," I explained. Jacobson pressed on. "How can anyone know if she's real, Judge, or just a government plant?" Judge Drago responded firmly. "Mr. Jacobson, I know this woman. I've known her since she was a child. I don't need the district attorney to verify her identity. Unless you have another objection, we will proceed with her testimony. Mr. Sullivan, you may begin." I leaned over to Mary Ellen and whispered, "You can do this." Winning a case requires 3 things: preparation, and a bit of luck. That day, we had all 3. Mary Ellen was well prepared, and she believed every word Jenny said. Jenny and I had crafted a story built on enough truths to make it convincing. Mary Ellen's slight nervousness added credibility, showing confidence in our case. Mary Ellen began by asking Jenny about her job. Judge Drago shook his head and asked, "What would your parents think, Miss Roe?" "Judge, you know my husband passed away, leaving me with our 2 boys. Social Security and workers' compensation don't cover everything," Jenny replied. reminding the judge of the workplace accident that had taken her husband's life and injured 6 others. Hearing Jenny's story made me think of Laura, wondering if she too chose family over dignity. But Jenny's reasons were far more serious. The defense lawyers tried to break Jenny, but she remained steadfast. Jacobson, the last to question her, tried to undermine her character. "Miss Rowe, you said you overheard a conversation after finishing work and were on your way to the bathroom. You can't remember everything, but you'd worked with 4 or 5 men by then, right?" he asked with a sarcastic smile. "Yes, that's right," Jenny replied. "So what does that make you?" he pressed. "Just what I told Mr. Sullivan when we first met. I'm just a regular person trying to get by," she answered. Even Judge Drago found a reason to laugh. And that's when Jacobson lost, as Jenny's story became the accepted truth. After leaving the courthouse, local TV stations were waiting. I forced myself to smile and express gratitude to the judge and the brave witness. The story made the 11 o'clock news and was discussed again the next morning. Dexter was unavailable for comment. Donations started pouring in, including a large contribution from Saul Solomon, which I suspected came from Laura. Edward Kincaid and Stephen also sent support, but the largest was $100,000 from a man in Vermont whose son had died of a drug overdose. When I shared my feelings of unworthiness with Bella, she looked at me with piercing eyes. "This is about you accepting what you've done. It doesn't matter what others think. You have to face your own truth," she said. Was she right? I wasn't sure anymore. The election campaign turned into a real battle. I'm not a politician, and the constant interactions drained me. Dexter caught a break when authorities made deals with the vultures, quickly moving them into protective custody. Their information on the drug trade outweighed the murder case. We tried to push for charges, but it seemed a deal was already in place. The state attorney general announced the deal, leaving us with little choice. Before I knew it, it was Election Day, the first Tuesday in November. As I prepared, I thought back to a year ago when I was getting ready for the Leroy Johnson trial. It was strange. I hadn't thought about him in a long time. He got probation and returned to his wife. I had survived my troubles, but at what cost? I wondered who felt better now. On Election Day, I visited polling places where the workers, both Democrats and Republicans, greeted me warmly. Around noon, I ran into Tommy LaCour. "Thank you, Pat. Win or lose, you've brought new life to the party. We owe you," he said with a big smile. Rumors were circulating that voter turnout was much higher than usual for an off-year election. This wasn't surprising, given that Dexter and I had spent nearly $15 per vote. Despite our efforts, Republicans still had twice as many registered voters. Just before 6 in the evening, I left the last polling place. Brandt, out of uniform, was with me, along with a couple dozen officers who had been supporting me all day. As we left the Polish-American Community Center, where the 14th election district voted, I stepped into the street just as it was getting dark. I heard a motorcycle before I saw it. The rider was coming fast, holding something in his right hand, a bat or a pole ready to strike. I could have run, but I knew I wouldn't get away. Just as he got near, I heard a loud bang. The rider slumped over and the motorcycle went out of control. It nearly missed me, but the back wheel clipped me, throwing me against a parked car. The next thing I remember, I was in a hospital bed, wired to machines. A nurse leaned over me. "Take it easy, don't try to move," she said. I heard her call to someone nearby, and then Laura appeared. I didn't need to see her face to know it was her. The doctors told me I had a stroke along with other injuries from the accident. My right arm was broken, and my left arm and leg weren't working properly. The road to recovery would be long and painful. A kind doctor visited me daily, but I could tell she was concerned about my progress. Laura stayed by my side, making decisions for me, despite my attempts to remind her we were getting a divorce. She brushed it off, saying, "We had that nonsense dismissed. Who will take care of you if not me?" When I was finally sent home, Laura arranged for a male nurse and physical therapist named Donald. He was tough, but I was determined. I promised Laura that once I recovered, I would restart the divorce process, though even I knew it sounded like a far-off dream. Weeks later, Laura took me to see a new doctor, Elizabeth Harper, who praised my progress and Donald's work. She hinted that I was ready to make your wife happy again, causing Laura to blush. On the way home, Laura was affectionate, but I kept some distance. My feelings for her were complicated. While I had once claimed to love Laura, I realized now that I hadn't been entirely honest. Not with her, and not with myself. Susan may have been the kind of beauty who turned every head, but Laura possessed a different kind of allure, one that went straight to the heart. While I usually prided myself on my self-control, when Laura turned on the charm, I was utterly helpless. That night, she came into my room dressed in something elegant. It had been nearly a year since we were this close, and I found it hard to resist. Her presence was intoxicating, her touch both cool and inviting. I had been through so much, but she had a way of making me feel alive again. As she drew closer, everything became more intense. "So, are you going to hold back as usual?" she teased. She was right, I couldn't hold back. She seemed determined to make this moment unforgettable. And as the night went on, a question from our past resurfaced in my mind. "Are we being careful?" I asked. She laughed, a sound full of joy. "Why should I worry? I'm with my husband and I'm about to become a senior partner. It's time to think about starting a family," she said. 3 weeks later, she showed me the pregnancy test, the little blue plus sign staring back at me. "Sorry, Pat, but it looks like you didn't really think you could win this, did you?" Laura said with a smirk. But the story wasn't over yet. There were more surprises ahead. Meanwhile, across the city, Governor Edward Kincaid was in his office overlooking the Hudson River. He had always imagined himself as a hero for the city, but as usual, reality made that a challenge. That Sunday, he met with 4 of the most powerful men in state government, including the Speaker of the Assembly and the Senate Majority Leader. They were there to discuss a legal dilemma that had arisen. Harvey Milhouse, the chief judge, was explaining why the court couldn't decide on the constitutionality of a new law, much to the frustration of the others. It was a tricky situation, one that threatened to make the party and the governor look foolish. As they debated, Kincaid realized just how complex and unpredictable the political landscape had become. In the end, the governor knew that his dreams of being a hero for New York City were being shaped by forces far beyond his control. The tides of the Hudson River, like the tides of politics, were constantly shifting, and all he could do was try to navigate them as best he could. Sarah Monk's downfall came swiftly. Despite her solid reputation as a school board member and town councilwoman, her brief affair with a younger lawyer resurfaced just days before the special election. Unflattering photos and claims from the lawyer's ex-wife derailed her campaign, giving the Democrats an unexpected victory in the state Senate. The celebration was short-lived. The outgoing Senate leader pushed through the Assembly's version of a special counsel bill, catching the new majority off guard. The bill, which no one really wanted, passed with a 5-year term limit as the only concession. Now the governor had to decide whether to sign it into law or face the backlash of a veto. Amid this political turmoil, the governor met with 4 key state officials, including Attorney General Sid Levy, a man of integrity who had a strong moral compass. Sid outlined the challenges of implementing the bill, its vagueness, lack of funding, and the need for a leader who was both respected and empathetic. Sid suggested that if such a person couldn't be found, the governor should veto the bill. As the group deliberated, the governor made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Don Pleasant Jr., the son of his head of security. Don had been keeping tabs on Patrick Sullivan, the former interim district attorney of Van Patten County, who had recently survived a serious attack. Despite his injuries, Sullivan was on the mend, and the governor saw potential in him. When the governor proposed Sullivan as the new leader, the room was skeptical, but eventually agreed. They recognized that Sullivan, though not from an Ivy League background, embodied the qualities needed for the role. Meanwhile, in a Hilton Midtown suite, Stephen Fitzgerald and Linda Siegel were enjoying a quiet evening together. Stephen reflected on his best friend Pat Sullivan's wife, Laura. On the surface, she appeared to be a confident and successful lawyer, but Stephen knew she was fragile, always seeking validation from others. This vulnerability, he thought, made her easy to manipulate. Linda, a sharp prosecutor, faced a new challenge in Foxy Fitzgerald, a lawyer with a solid case for her opponent's suicide. Despite her initial confidence, Linda found herself attracted to Foxy, who proved to be both skilled and captivating. After a passionate night together, Linda discovered that Foxy's client was indeed innocent, realizing the case had more layers than she thought. Foxy hinted at secrets Carolyn Wellesley was hiding, which troubled Linda deeply. Linda and Foxy decided to meet again, and as she drove home, she reflected on the complex emotions stirred by her opponent. Meanwhile, Laura, pregnant and struggling, confided in Susan about her troubled marriage with Pat, who had been promoted to special prosecutor. Laura felt unappreciated and worried about Pat's close relationships with ambitious women in his office. She shared a painful story of a recent cooking disaster and her struggle to be a good wife, revealing Pat's troubling past. Susan listened, offering a supportive but unsentimental response. Laura and Susan discussed the thrill Laura felt from Pat's violent past, which now seemed exhilarating rather than frightening. Laura admitted she enjoyed the edge it gave their relationship, even though she knew she should hate it. Meanwhile, Philip Sloan, recently dismissed as chief investigator by the new district attorney, was hired as a consultant by Pat Sullivan. At 62, Sloan just wanted a few more years before retirement, avoiding complaints despite his unexpected dismissal. He had previously warned Sullivan about a federal investigation not linked to gangs and was now navigating FBI tactics to uncover the truth. Sloan visited Sullivan at the Justice Building, where he was offered a consulting job on the condition he wouldn't be reimbursed for expenses. Sullivan needed Sloan to investigate an attack on Senator Hoffman's wife immediately. Later, Sloan waited at a diner for Elizabeth Duncan, a nurse at Mercy General Hospital. Beth, who had raised her children alone after her husband's death and later divorced a lazy second husband, frequented the diner after her shifts. Sloan, sitting alone, invited her to join him. Their conversation quickly grew comfortable, and he asked her out, leading to several weeks of dating and getting to know each other better. When Phil wasn't with Beth, he was gathering intel at the state prison. Janet Hoffman, a longtime counselor there, was a valuable source of information. Phil learned that if someone avoided a question, they likely had important details. His investigation into Reverend Jean Paul Bell Mount and Janet Hoffman was nearly complete, but he needed one final piece of information from Beth, who had been on duty the night Senator Hoffman arrived with his wife. Beth was nervous about their evening together, but excited, having not been intimate in 3 years. As they approached her bedroom, she worried about her appearance but felt reassured by Phil's calm demeanor. They shared a tender moment, and afterward, Phil playfully asked if it helped her forget about a subpoena she had mentioned. Beth's guilt surfaced, but Phil assured her it was no big deal. Beth revealed her concerns about the Hoffmans and their miscarriage, which she had been involved in as a nurse. She didn't want to add to their pain. Phil comforted her, feeling guilty for misleading her. Later, Mary Ellen Seaman arrived at the office seeking a job. Despite not having a budget, she insisted on working and demonstrated her commitment by offering to take an unpaid agreement. She also revealed her sexuality, making it clear she was determined to work there. Reluctantly, I agreed to hire her, recognizing the pressure to manage a budget and the need for more staff. With a bright office and the pressure mounting, I had to request a budget to pay my growing team. Despite my reluctance and the challenges, I knew it was necessary to keep things running smoothly. We sat in comfy chairs by a love seat and coffee table. Saul Solomon handed me a cup of strong coffee, its pink rose design reminiscent of my Aunt Sophia's china. Saul spoke of how New York changes quickly, pointing out my own rapid rise from assistant DA to state special counsel for public corruption. I confided my budget issue, which Saul noted was tricky given the need to ask lawmakers for funds to investigate them. Saul suggested hiring a good lobbyist to secure temporary funding. He offered his services, promising his best effort in exchange for my appreciation. I agreed to a handshake deal, knowing Saul knew when to choose the right side. Brandt later visited me, worried about potential FBI scrutiny over a biker gang story. He feared exposure of his connection to Laura and Patterson could jeopardize his future. I reassured him to avoid conspiracy charges, emphasizing his concerns about a scandal involving an affair. Returning to my office, I found Phil with handwritten notes. I requested the official prison report and planned to issue subpoenas for the prison and hospital, focusing on the wife and Reverend for the indictment. I think Senator Hoffman will plead guilty once he realizes we know, I told Sloan, who seemed distant. Are you okay, Phil? I asked. Yeah, just feeling guilty, he replied. 2 days after serving Mrs. Hoffman with a subpoena, my friend Stephen showed up unexpectedly. I was preparing evidence for a grand jury on the Hoffman case, borrowing a jury already set for a commercial fraud case. Stephen, representing Janet Hoffman, calmly demanded I cancel the subpoena. "I'm sorry, but I can't," I said. He responded that Mrs. Hoffman would invoke her Fifth Amendment rights. I offered immunity, but Stephen countered she would use spousal privilege. Mary Ellen, taking notes, pointed out spousal privilege doesn't apply to crimes against one's partner. "Thank you for the heads up, counselor," I said, keeping my composure. After Stephen left, Mary was concerned, but I suspected he was sending a message. "What's the message?" she asked. "Let's figure it out," I replied. I tasked her with checking Sloane's report while I reviewed his notes. The next day, I was uneasy, fearing I had missed something. Laura, now a suspect due to our tense divorce, was struggling with FBI inquiries and her challenging pregnancy. Despite my attempts to reassure her, the situation was difficult. She burnt the microwave and broke the food processor while trying to cook spaghetti, a dish she usually avoided. I advised her to decline FBI interviews and respond in writing through her lawyer, but she worried about appearing guilty. "Laura, you are guilty," I said, confronting her about the affair and the incident with Patterson. She denied it, insisting Frank was innocent, but I was firm. After another rough night, I discovered a crucial detail in the Hoffman case. A police report from the night Mrs. Hoffman went to the hospital revealed blood on the passenger seat of Senator Hoffman's state car. Hoffman had been traveling across upstate New York promoting natural gas drilling. The car had been examined without a warrant, but no arrests were made because Mrs. Hoffman claimed she had just fallen. The senator hadn't been interviewed or defended himself. This finding could change everything. Frank Patterson felt uneasy, certain a car was tailing him. It was a nondescript sedan that seemed to appear and vanish, always reappearing in his rearview mirror. His Mercedes GT was an easy target in city traffic, and whispers about an FBI probe only added to his anxiety. Frank, used to being a top player in a high-profile law firm, was flustered by the situation with Laura Parker. Unlike other husbands, Laura's spouse wasn't accepting of Frank's involvement. His recent encounters with Saul Solomon, who had warned him about Sullivan's rising influence, left Frank feeling humiliated. Now, as he tried to enjoy a date with a waitress named Trina, who was not his usual type but a welcome distraction, he found himself distracted by the thought of Fitzgerald mocking him. Despite Solomon's cold shoulder and his own frustrations, he felt he had to act. In the courtroom, Judge Thompson's patience was running thin with attorney Matthew Rosencrans. The judge was frustrated with Rosencrans's insistence on rights and immunity for his client, which seemed to defy legal norms. I knew the judge's anger was directed at me, too, as he warned of reporting any shady dealings. Meanwhile, Senator Hoffman appeared nervous before the grand jury, his face a mix of fear and anger. The jury, led by a serious and principled Asian Indian woman in her 60s, was tough but fair. Despite the respectful professionalism, I struggled with the distracting, friendly glances and comments from the Deputy Attorney General's team, leading Sid Levy to offer to step in. When Senator Hoffman was sworn in, he invoked spousal privilege for everything, leaving me with little to go on. I probed about his whereabouts on March 25th. Hoffman vaguely recalled being home before 9:46 p.m., though he'd left Rochester just before 8 p.m., Witnesses indicated that the drive should have taken longer, suggesting discrepancies in his account. That night, a storm was raging in Rochester. I asked Senator Hoffman if it was snowing, and he mumbled a barely audible yes. I leaned in, pressing, "Senator, you barely had time to get home, find your wife in trouble, and get her to the hospital. If you didn't hurt her, who did?" Hoffman clenched his jaw. "I won't say anything about my wife," he replied defiantly. I glanced at the jury forewoman, questioning whether he could invoke spousal privilege to avoid answering. I sensed Hoffman was hoping I'd push him for answers, making him look bad in the press. Instead, I remained calm, aware of his growing frustration. Hoffman lashed out, calling me a political manipulator and accusing me of being a part of the governor's team, trying to protect my family. Tears streamed down his face as he pleaded with the jury not to let politics dictate justice. I pressed further, asking about his son, Jerry Jr. After some prodding, Hoffman revealed that his son had attacked his wife. causing her injury and leading to a miscarriage. Hoffman had rushed her to the hospital, and the family tried to cover up the incident amidst public and political pressure. Urged the jury not to charge the senator, which they agreed to. However, the head juror asked if they should charge the son. I explained I could only act on those in elected positions, but advised them to forward the issue to local authorities. In the meantime, the death of Frank Patterson, a well-known lawyer, made headlines. Found dead from a heroin overdose, his death was ruled accidental. Rumors circulated about a dark-haired woman seen with him, but no evidence linked anyone else to his death. The state police concluded it was an overdose, though doubts remained. To minimize the fallout, I timed the grand jury's decision to be released late Thursday afternoon, hoping it would be overshadowed by the weekend news cycle. But as I headed home, reporters were already waiting at my front door, asking about a statement from Stephen Fitzgerald, who claimed I couldn't build a case and was avoiding the issue. I replied with a chuckle, "Maybe he thinks he can do a better job." As I slipped into the house, I felt something was off. It was dark and quiet, though Laura's car was in the driveway. I found her in the back bedroom, fully dressed and breathing heavily. She looked pale and unwell. I tried to wake her, but she didn't respond. I called 911, and the ambulance arrived while reporters filmed. I followed Laura to the hospital, where I was shown to a waiting room. The TV was filled with news about the ongoing case. 2 hours later, Laura's doctor, an older woman with gray hair, confronted me. "Do you understand what it means to be a husband and father?" she asked sharply. "Your wife needed to work less and eat more. Did you even notice?" I admitted that Laura had been struggling with eating since a kitchen accident. The doctor scolded me for not paying attention. Laura was dehydrated, underweight, and anemic. The baby might be at risk too. She left me with a stern reminder to step up. Laura was stable but still asleep when I was allowed into her room. I tried to stay awake in the uncomfortable chair. Early the next morning, Laura woke up as the hospital prepared her for a room transfer. Susan Singleton walked in, excitedly announcing that the governor was coming to visit. The governor, Edward Kincaid, arrived and praised my work on the Hoffman case. He reassured Laura and then asked me for an update on the case. I briefed him, and he instructed me to keep details quiet while he managed Hoffman's career. He emphasized the need to present a unified, positive front to the public. At the press conference, I addressed questions about the case and my wife's health. Susan stepped in to cut it short, sending me back to Laura's room. Laura woke up around noon, and I asked, "What's going on, Laura? Why haven't you been eating?" She looked apologetic. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I didn't mean to cause any. I just feel sick." "You could have told me you were struggling," I said. "I couldn't. I'm failing as a wife and might fail as a mother too," Laura replied, tears welling up. "You're not failing. We'll manage your meals and rest, and Solomon can handle things without you for a while," I reassured her. "It's not that simple," she said. "I've tried, but it hasn't worked." "We'll try together," I insisted. "You need to trust that we're a team now." She started crying, and the nurse asked me to step outside. I spent 3 days at the hospital before Laura was finally discharged. Meanwhile, reporters bombarded my office and tried to sneak into the hospital. On the 3rd day, the doctor told me, "Your wife is ready to go home. She needs constant care, not work. I've arranged a home nurse, but you should also hire a health aide." I mentioned Laura's resistance to accepting help, feeling it was a sign of her struggle with our marriage. The doctor advised me to stay positive for her and the baby, reminding me that sometimes we must do what's best for our family, not just what we want. I reluctantly agreed. We hired a warm, experienced home health aide who connected well with Laura and helped her with both her spirits and nutrition. Then came a call from Jack Rubens at the Rochester Gazette. He pressed for details about the Hoffman's case. I told him I was aware of his investigation but offered no comment. I suggested that if his article was fair, I'd send him a copy of my report. Rubens' article was balanced, though it hinted at our involvement. New York tabloids were less kind, splashing sensational photos of Mrs. Hoffman and her lover. We responded with a measured statement, clarifying Senator Hoffman's innocence based on travel evidence. Saul Solomon called, informing me that the Democrats had increased my salary to match the governor's as a sign of their support. I thanked him, genuinely appreciative. Later, Saul urged me to read the New York Times editorial praising my handling of the Hoffman case. Despite initial doubts about my experience and connections, the editorial recognized my capability and bravery, and the office's future now rested with lawmakers. I had one final issue to resolve, but for now I felt a mix of relief and accomplishment. Laura was over 7 months pregnant, feeling better physically but still struggling emotionally. I had misjudged her strength. What I saw as confidence was actually a front hiding her insecurities. She wasn't seeing me as a partner, but as support, and she had expected me to be there for her no matter what. Laura's fears about the baby's future grew as the due date approached. We had chosen the names Bridget for my mother and Ellen for hers. I spent time in the backyard, swinging with our newborn Bridget in my arms. She was tiny, weighing just 6 pounds, but she stole my heart instantly. Over the weeks, I noticed some white strands in her dark hair, as my mother had predicted. After the relatives left, Laura, now recovering at home with some help, adjusted quickly to being a mother. She returned from the hospital the same day she gave birth, despite medical advice to stay longer. Laura told me she wouldn't use birth control anymore and planned to be a traditional housewife, though she'd still work part-time. I agreed to the kitchen commitment, but set boundaries about another baby. Laura laughed and accepted the terms, then asked if she was forgiven. I told her I loved her and our daughter, and although I wouldn't say I forgave her, I was staying. As I left for a meeting with politicians, I took a last look at Laura holding Bridget. Her happiness and relaxation were clear, and I was determined to protect my family. The memorial service for Frank Patterson took place in a 19th-century church in Troy, built from Manhattan sandstone. The church was known for its stained glass windows and open-minded approach. The service was well organized by a junior associate, though the deceased was Methodist in a largely Episcopal setting. Saul Solomon was pleased with the turnout and kept his comments focused on the service, avoiding any rumors about Frank's death. Afterward, Saul noticed Stephen Fitzgerald waiting outside. Fitzgerald, who Saul knew briefly as a client, greeted him with a small smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fitzgerald," Saul said. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Please call me Foxy," Fitzgerald replied. "And you can call me Sal." Saul nodded, noting that Fitzgerald's wife, Martha, was fetching their Lincoln. A practical choice, Saul mused, as he walked through the church's stained glass entrance. "You know my wife, Susan, don't you?" Steve said. "Yes, she's lovely." "You're lucky," Saul replied. Steve nodded. "At times like these, it's important to remember our blessings." Saul hesitated before asking, "Some think Frank's death wasn't an accident. What's your take?" Stephen's expression grew serious. "Frank made a series of poor choices that led to his tragic end. Sometimes results aren't clear until it's too late. When you challenge stronger opponents, losing is often part of the game." Saul nodded. "Wisely said. It's like using the cunning of a fox rather than the strength of a wolf." Stephen smiled. "Just a guess. No proof. But the real danger came from another direction." Saul's tone hardened. "Did the wolf arrive before or after the priest hurt you?" Stephen remained unfazed. "Somewhere in between. You should have seen the priest's face. He chose a place where no one could hear. Pat is very protective. When he loses his temper, it's deadly. Fortunately, someone heard the priest's screams." Saul said, "I think you're just as dangerous when you're being foxy." Stephen nodded. "A fox uses wits, not just feelings. Actions have consequences." As Stephen departed in his shiny Mercedes, Saul's wife's Lincoln town car arrived. Saul got in, and Martha asked, "Is something wrong? You seem off?" Saul replied, "I'm fine, just reflecting on my mistakes." Martha noted, "It was a lovely service. You should be proud. It's a shame Laura and her husband couldn't make it." Saul smiled, appreciating her support. "Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like."